Every anxiety you carry, every decision you've avoided, every relationship you've played small in, traces back to one single fear you've probably never looked at directly. And the moment you do, something shifts, not gradually, immediately. The ancient thinkers who mapped this out weren't being philosophical, they were being surgical. In this video, I'll show you number one, why death anxiety is the hidden engine behind most of your daily stress, even when death feels completely irrelevant to what you're worrying about. Number two, what the Vedic framework for the self actually says, and why it works as a psychological tool even if you hold zero spiritual beliefs. Number three, the one internal shift that moves this from something you intellectually agree with to something that actually changes how you make decisions. Let's get into it. A man named Arjunu stood on a battlefield, surrounded by people he loved, and completely froze. Not from cowardice, from clarity. He could suddenly see exactly what was going to happen, who was going to die, what he was going to lose. And in that moment, every reason he had for being there evaporated. He sat down in his chariot, put down his weapons, and said he couldn't do it. Most people read that story as a crisis of courage. It wasn't, it was a crisis of identity. He didn't know who he was without the things he was about to lose. That's the same place most of us are operating from every single day, without the battlefield to make it obvious. Think about the last time you felt anxious about something that, on the surface, seemed completely mundane. Maybe it was a performance review at work. Maybe it was a conversation you kept putting off. Maybe it was checking your bank account. On the surface, those feel like separate problems. Career stress, relationship stress, money stress. But in the 1970s, a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker published a book that won the Pulitzer Prize and got almost no mainstream attention. His argument was simple and devastating. Most of human behavior is a defense mechanism against the awareness of death. Not death the event, death the concept, the knowledge which only humans carry that we are temporary. Becker called it the immortality project. Every status symbol, every legacy building, every desperate need to be liked, every conflict we avoid because we can't handle the idea of a relationship ending, it all traces back to the same thing. We are trying to prove to ourselves and to the world that we matter enough to persist. Psychologists built an entire research framework on top of Becker's work called terror management theory. And what they found across hundreds of studies is that when you remind people of their mortality, even subtly, their behavior changes in predictable ways. They become more defensive of their worldview, more hostile to people who think differently, more likely to seek status, more likely to conform. None of this is conscious. That's the point. The fear is running in the background, and you're just experiencing the outputs, the anxiety, the avoidance, the need for approval, the feeling that you can never quite relax. The Vedic texts identified this same mechanism thousands of years before Becker. The Sanskrit word is abhinivesha. It's listed as one of the 5 kleshas, the 5 root afflictions that generate suffering, and it doesn't translate simply as fear of death. It translates closer to the clinging to existence, the deep instinctive grip of the self on its own continuation. The Yoga Sutras say abhinivesha is present even in the wise. It's not a character flaw, it's a feature of being a self-aware creature. The question isn't whether you have it. The question is whether it's driving your life without your knowledge. So the first thing to understand is this. Overcoming fear of death isn't a morbid exercise. It's the most practical thing you can do for your daily mental health because you're not fighting individual anxieties anymore. You're addressing the root system that feeds all of them. Before I give you the framework, I want to describe what it feels like to be missing it. Imagine you've built your entire sense of self around a specific role. Parent, executive, partner, athlete, and then that role gets taken away through illness, through a breakup, through being passed over. For the promotion you'd built your identity around. The grief people feel in those moments is disproportionate to the practical loss because they're not just losing a job or a relationship, they're losing the proof that they exist in a meaningful way. The Vedic framework starts with a distinction that sounds simple but takes time to actually feel. It separates the Atma, the self, from the body-mind complex. The body is what you inhabit. The Atma is what you are. Now, I want to be careful here because this can slide quickly into something that sounds like religious reassurance. It's not. Let me give you the psychological version. You have already experienced yourself as distinct from your body and your thoughts. Every time you've observed your own thinking, The part of you doing the observing is not the thought itself. Every time you've watched yourself react emotionally and then step back from that reaction, the part doing the watching is not the emotion. This is not philosophy. This is something you can test right now. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the text that contains the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna on that battlefield, describes the self this way: weapons cannot cut it, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it. It is eternal, all pervading, stable, immovable, and ancient. A secular reader might hear that and think that's a beautiful metaphor, and it is. But the ancient teachers weren't primarily making a metaphysical claim. They were giving you a cognitive anchor, a place to stand when everything around you is moving. Because the problem with death anxiety isn't really the fear of non existence, it's the fear of losing the things that make you feel like you exist: status, relationships, health, continuity of story. When you have a stable sense of self that isn't dependent on any of those things, the fear doesn't have the same grip. The Vedic teachers call this viveka, discernment, the trained ability to distinguish between what you are and what you are experiencing. And they were explicit that this isn't a belief you adopt, it's a capacity you develop through practice, the same way you develop any other cognitive skill. Terry Patton, a researcher in integral theory, described it this way: most people live in a state of identification with the content of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. The content changes, consciousness doesn't. When you learn to rest in the latter, impermanence stops being a threat. This is what the Gita was pointing Arjuna toward. Not a pep talk, not a motivational speech, a complete reorientation of where he was locating his sense of self. There's a pattern I've seen repeatedly. Someone reads the Gita, or they read about terror management theory, or they hear a talk on the Atma and they nod. They find it genuinely compelling. They tell a friend about it. And then 6 weeks later, they are still making decisions from the same place of fear they were before. The understanding stayed intellectual. It never became operational. The ancient teachers were very specific about why this happens. They called the gap between intellectual understanding and lived realization the difference between jnana and vijnana. Jnana is knowledge. Vijnana is direct experience of what you know. And they said the second one requires a completely different kind of practice. The reason most people stay at the intellectual level is that the body-mind system has a very strong investment in not updating this belief. Your nervous system has been running the mortality defense program for your entire life. It's not going to step aside because you read something interesting. So, what actually creates the shift? The Vedic tradition points to three things working together. The first is repeated contemplation, not reading once and moving on, but sitting with the same ideas until they start to feel self evident rather than merely logical. The Gita describes this as Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, hearing, reflecting, absorbing. The second is what modern psychology would call behavioral exposure. You have to make decisions that your fear self would not make. Small ones at first, the conversation you keep avoiding, the creative project you keep shelving because what if it fails? Each time you act from the stable self rather than the defended self, you're building a new reference point. The third, and this is the one most people skip entirely, is working with someone who can see your blind spots. The Vedic tradition was emphatic about this. The guru function wasn't about authority or devotion. It was about the simple fact that you cannot see the back of your own head. The patterns that are running your life are, by definition, the ones you can't see clearly from inside them. Arjuna didn't figure this out alone. He was in a direct conversation on a battlefield with someone who could reflect back to him exactly what was happening and why. Overcoming fear of death isn't a solo project. The intellectual part can be. But the moment where it becomes real, where you find yourself in a genuinely threatening situation and you notice the fear without being consumed by it, that usually happens in the context of a relationship where you've done the actual work. The practical test is this: the next time you feel a wave of anxiety, before you try to solve the surface problem, ask one question: what specifically am I afraid of losing? And then ask the second question: who would I be without that thing? If the second question produces panic, you found the root. If it produces curiosity, you've already started the shift. That's the movement the Vedic framework is pointing at. Not the elimination of fear, the ability to be present with it, look directly at what it's protecting, and choose from somewhere deeper than the protection. And if that second question just surfaced something you've been carrying for a long time, that's exactly the kind of thing worth looking at with another set of eyes. If you've tried working through this on your own, you've read the books, you understand it conceptually, but you're still making decisions from fear, still shrinking in situations where you know you shouldn't be. The fastest way through that gap is a real conversation, not a course, not another video, a conversation. I do free 15 to 30-minute calls, no pitch, no agenda beyond this. Figure out exactly where you're stuck and what the clearest next step looks like for your specific situation. You'll walk away with that, whether we ever work together or not. The link to book is in the description at dailymindreset.com/consultation. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What's the one thing you've been avoiding that, if you're honest, has fear of loss underneath it?